Hello friends, welcome back to my channel. If you don't know who I am, my name is Melissa and you found yourself at Melissa's Cozy Corner where we talk about books, baking, and other cozy content. And today we'll be focusing on books because today's video is what I've read so far in my fall TBR, which is so fun to say. If you haven't said it yet, it's what I've read so far in my fall TBR. I think I'm gonna have to create a song, but this is week 1 of that series. So what I've planned for this season is every other week is going to be kind of a book focused video where we're going to talk about books I've read so far in my fall TBR, and then the week after is going to be focused on like a craft or a baking thing or something outside, a little bit more of a fun activity. So we're going to have this really nice balance of books and activities, and I think it's going to be so fun. So if you haven't subscribed, I highly recommend it because I would love for you to join me on this fun little adventure of our fall autumnal fun activities. And if you haven't seen my fall TBR, you can find it here or in the description below. I talked about all the books I'm aiming to read this season, and of course other books are going to kind of pop in magically. Like, one of the books I've read so far already has inspired me to read another book, so there might be some new books slipping in here and there. But the goal is to read all of the books that I've put on my fall TBR, which I'm really excited about, and so that's what this video is about. This is episode 1 of this series, and we're going to be talking about 3 books that I've already read, and that's Smothermoss by Alisa Alering, Diary of a Void by Emi Yagi, and The Paris Bookseller by Kerri Maher. These 3 books are all very intriguing, very interesting, and so different from one another, and I'm really excited to talk about all 3 of them. But before we get to that, I kind of want to make a plan for you so you know what to expect. At the beginning of this video, I'm going to talk about each of the books with no spoilers, so that way you can watch the first half of this video without having to skip around. So I'm going to talk about all 3 of the books, tell you about the genres, tell you about the themes, the ideas, what's happening, and then I'm going to move to the spoiler section. So if you've read these books and just want to hear another opinion, then you have the spoiler section of this video. So the first half for everybody, second half for the people who want to hear spoilers. I would also highly encourage you not to put any spoilers in the comments below, just because I want to make sure everybody has kind of the openness to be able to read these books without being spoiled first. However, if you feel the need to talk about something, please write like spoiler in caps or big and then press enter, and then your thoughts below. That way when people are scrolling through the comments, they don't see your spoiler very quickly and they can, skip past it if they don't want to read it. But again, try not to write any spoilers so that way everybody has the opportunity to enjoy these books just as much as we have. So let's go ahead and start with the first book I read, which is Smothermoss by Alisa Alering. I actually found this book on YouTube. There was a YouTuber who recommended it. I can't remember her name off the top of my head. I just accidentally found her when I was scrolling through books that are going to be interesting or being released, and Smothermoss was one of them. And the reason I actually got this was, one, because the YouTuber expressed, if I remember the YouTuber's name, I'm going to put her in the comments below, but the YouTuber had mentioned that this has to deal with like a magical mountain and 2 sisters, and that kind of like won my brain, and it has to deal with kind of like this life-death kind of interaction between things, and the cover is just so beautiful. I love how the bunnies mirror each other, but they have like this beautiful contrast as well. So this is a very intriguing book. We do follow 2 sisters who live in the mountains and are kind of from a lower class family, or you can consider them from a poor family. They live with their mother and also somebody who they consider like their grandmother, and they live in this beautiful forest. One day, 2 other women end up getting murdered in the mountains, and we end up following one sister who's investigating the murder and the other sister who's just trying to figure out who she is and what is going on in her own personal life. So these 2 sisters are on a search of something that's deep and mysterious and confusing, and we end up getting a very interesting interaction that was kind of surprising. So the first chapter is actually from the mountain's perspective and is absolutely gorgeous. I do want to read you just the first little piece so that way you can kind of get an idea of how this book is written. It is happening again. Snow melts, the crust of frost cracks and heaves. Water sinks below ground, swelling channels. Sap rises. Wild garlic sprouts. Arbutus creeps, and bloodroot quickens. Curved shoots of spotted skunk cabbage thrust toward the sky. Beetle larvae wake and gorge. Red-tailed hawks wheel and shriek. Gusts sweep a fledgling from the nest, hard smack on the ground. The countless populations that call this mountain home are awaking, but the seeds of decline are already sown. Eggshells soften, limbs fail to form, leaves wither and curdle, water roils brackish and sour. Overhead the stars, distant cold brothers, who knew the world before the mountain was formed, revolve unmoved. Redness flares, scabs multiply, membranes stretch thin. That's the moment when unpredictable things seep in. So you already get this kind of perspective of this like darkness, uncomfortableness, and this mysterious being, which is not really a being, it's actually the mountain, and it's just beautifully written. It's quite confusing, I have to admit. It's one of those books that I feel like I'm going to have to read again. I've talked about this book already a little bit in some of my other videos. It is a lot like Mona Awad in the feeling, so like if you've read Bunny by Mona Awad, you're gonna get kind of that confusion, distortion, and just questionable narrative, which is odd, but also very fascinating. If you've liked books like Bunny or Rouge by Mona Awad, I think you might like this one as well. This is actually a debut novel by Alisa Alering, and I thought it was super, super interesting, absolutely lovely, and definitely mind-boggling. So be prepared to have to reread paragraphs sometimes, or be confused, or question what's reality and what's not reality. The genre of this book is more gothic, horror, fantastical. I think that's kind of like the best way to describe this. I think it does move more to the gothic horror side of things, but it is really fascinating and such an interesting debut novel. So if you're looking for something odd, a little bit gothic, and a little bit mind-boggling, you actually might really like this one. I enjoyed it, and I would read something else by Alisa Alering when they publish something. The next book I ended up reading was by Emi Yagi, Diary of a Void. I actually looked for this book everywhere for about a year. I was determined, and I don't know why, but I was determined to find this book in a bookshop, and I didn't. So I finally ended up just buying it online from the bookshop that I was looking for it at. And I'm happy I got it. I'm happy I read it. I've been wanting to read this one. I think there was somebody who mentioned it a while ago, and I was like, oh, that sounds very interesting, intriguing. If I remember who mentioned it, I'll put them in the description below so you can check out their videos. But this one was intriguing to me because it was all the YouTuber I remember saying was, this woman pretends to be pregnant and we end up following what happens through the lie. And I was intrigued. I wanted to know what was going to happen. So this ends up being kind of like a slice of life book of this young woman. I would consider her young because she's my age. And she ends up pretending to be pregnant, and we end up following her through that lie. So how the lie started, how the lie evolved, and how we end up watching her evolve through the lie as well. I'm gonna interrupt myself real fast because I forgot to mention something extremely important, and it's one of the things that actually motivates this character to pretend to be pregnant, to create this lie about being pregnant, and it's this gender stereotype that's being shoved on her at her workplace and in society itself. So her workplace, she's the only woman that works at this office, and she's expected to make the coffee, to clean up after everybody, to pass out the goodies, to watch out as the quote-unquote woman in the office. And so to get some sort of respect, she ends up creating this lie about being pregnant, which then makes it so she doesn't have to make the coffee. She's not cleaning up after everybody, and she's able to go home at a decent time, at a normal time, unlike when she wasn't pregnant. So there ends up being this really strong push of this gender equality or gender stereotypes throughout this novel that end up creating this woman to need to create this lie. It ends up being very uncomfortable at times, but also very interesting in how things end up changing as she starts getting further along in her quote-unquote pregnancy. Okay, now back to the video. It's really intriguing. It's the best way to describe this book is Fremdschämen, which is a German word to mean like you feel the shame and uncomfortableness the character feels or the person feels. So if they feel uncomfortable, you also are feeling those uncomfortable feelings. So Fremdschämen is really just the best word to describe this book. I thought it was really well done. It was interesting because I thought the writing was slightly boring, but you were so invested in the story that it was boring on purpose, if that makes sense. So you're almost just following the diaries of this woman talking about her lie and how it's changing her life and how it's influencing her day-to-day life, but it's also just kind of a diary of some normal person. So it's not anything uplifting or powerful or scary or exciting. It's just a diary. So if you're looking kind of for more of a slice of life, this is a Japanese contemporary fiction that's just intriguing in a certain way and makes you wonder what's going to happen. So through the whole entire story, I had no idea how it was going to end, and that made me so excited. So if you're looking for something that's just a little different, a little odd, this kind of gives me the feelings of After Dark by Murakami. This doesn't have kind of the same mystical magical realism Murakami writes, but it does have those types of storytelling that After Dark did, where you're just kind of following the storyline and seeing where it goes, and when it comes to an end, it comes to an end. And that's kind of how I felt about this one. So if you liked After Dark, you might like this one, but you also might find it boring. This is for a very specific group of people, but I liked it. I thought it was interesting. I would read something by Emi Yagi again, but I'm not sure if I would read this one again. But I don't know. I could, because I didn't dislike it. It was just odd. And the last book I ended up finishing just today was The Paris Bookseller by Kerri Maher. This is really a beautiful book. A friend actually lent this to me because she knew I was going to be going to Paris, and she said this is a perfect book for anybody who loves the city of Paris, but also loves books, because this is actually about a bookseller named Sylvia Beach, and she opened Shakespeare and Company in Paris in the 1919, I believe? Yep, 1919. And it's an English bookshop in the middle of Paris. It was absolutely perfect. I actually did not read it on the way to Paris, but I read it coming back, and I read it over the last couple of days, and I thought it was absolutely perfect. I loved reading it coming back because I was able to actually see Montmartre and Notre Dame and the Eiffel Tower and all these other places. And I actually went to go see the new shop, Shakespeare and Company, and I went and saw where the shop actually was. It was kind of really cool knowing that I walked on the street that Hemingway walked on, or James Joyce, and it was just so fun and so special. So let me tell you about the book now. So the book is actually about Sylvia Beach, who opened up, as I said, Shakespeare and Company in Paris in 1919. This is a historical fiction, so it follows true events that happened, but of course the author, Kerri Maher, had to make some adjustments so the storyline flowed a bit better. But she did pull a lot from different papers and stories, and also by Sylvia Beach's biography. So this book did pull in factual events that actually happened, which I found really exciting. We follow this woman falling in love with the city of Paris and opening her first bookshop and the first English bookshop in Paris. And it's just a beautiful story. We end up following her struggles and her adventures through, one, opening the shop, but then also meeting all of these amazing writers who weren't known back then. So we have Hemingway and James Joyce and so many others. And during that time, Ulysses was being written, and Ulysses was considered lustful and dirty and not something the regular audience would read. And what ended up happening was it ended up getting banned from the US. Nobody wanted to publish it because it was too erotic and intense. And so we have Sylvia Beach, who decides to take the step forward and publish Ulysses for James Joyce. We follow the relationships between Sylvia and her family, Sylvia and these other writers and artists, Sylvia and her love, and we just get to have a look behind the scene of what art and writing and love looked like back in the 1920s, and it was truly beautiful. I really enjoyed this. If you like reading any books that take place in Paris, of course this would be good, but what I meant is if you like reading books that follow the life of somebody who really triumphs and works hard and does everything she can to make not just the people around her happy, but make them move forward in life. She's constantly trying to improve the lives around her by just being a passionate and loving friend. And so this is a very intriguing book, very loving, very heartwarming but heartbreaking, and it was a delight to read. I really loved this book. I thought it was perfect for this season because I was able to feel like I was cozy and warm with Sylvia and her love in their cute little apartment, and it was just really, really well done. You get to learn so much about all of these different writers, but also Ulysses. I now have the urge to read that book, which I've never wanted to read. It's a hefty book, but I'm still questioning if I need to read it or not. But it's just really, really awesome and a great kind of peek behind the curtain of what was happening in the 1920s with art and books and writing and how it actually influenced books and writing of today. So if you like those types of books, I highly recommend this. If you like any historical fictions, I actually recommend this as well. I'm a big historical fiction reader, so if you like anything like that, I think you'll like this. I read The Women at the beginning of the year by Kristen Hanna, and I've also read The Nightingale by Kristen Hanna, but there's so many other authors I've read. She's just the first one that's popping into my head right now. And if you like any of those historical fiction novels, then I think you'll like this one as well, especially if you love books, especially if you like reading about authors. I think this would be a very delightful novel for you. So those are the 3 books I've read so far. I've really loved them. I don't know what I'm going to be reading next. I'm going to be following the TBR list so that way I can publish episode 2 of what I've read so far in my Fall TBR. But those are at least the first 3 I've read, and I've really enjoyed all 3 of them. I was flabbergasted the fact that I liked all 3. That's a very, I wouldn't say seldom accomplishment, but it's so great when you can actually read a few books in a row that you're just like, wow, I really like this. I can't wait to read another book that I really like. So I've had a lot of luck. I highly recommend them. So we have one that's a gothic horror, one that's a slice of life Japanese contemporary, and one that's a historical fiction that's just lovely and kind. I think these are great. Yeah. But if you don't want to be spoiled, I highly recommend that you say goodbye now, and maybe you read these and then you can come back and then watch the spoiler side. But I thought I would go into spoilers and talk a little bit more about what happened in the books, what I thought of them, and what I thought about the endings, because I think the ending in all 3 of these were just crazy. So I appreciate those of you who have stuck around, and this is your time to say goodbye, because I'm going to go into spoilers. And the first one is going to be Smothermoss. So if you have not left yet, I would say goodbye. Goodbye. 3. That's a 2. 3, 2, 1. Spoiler time. So Smothermoss by Alisa Alering. This is such a strange little book. I finished this thinking to myself, did I actually understand what was happening? And I didn't. I didn't understand what was happening. I felt confused. I felt uncomfortable, and then I thought about it for a while, and there was a part of me that was like, oh. So we have these 2 sisters, like I had mentioned, and these 2 sisters are at very different points in their life. And we have the younger sister who is full of life and excitement and mystery, and she believes in magic, and she ends up drawing these like little tarot cards that she says speaks to her. And she's saying that every time she feels the urge, she needs to draw these tarot cards because they're telling her to draw them. And she ends up drawing these different creatures and different things, and each card tells her where to be laid. So for example, one card is, I believe, the Worm King, and this Worm King is pretty much death. It's the end. and the Worm King wants to be laid with the grandmother because it's coming to the grandmother's end, and she tries to refuse the Worm King's wants, but she can't, and the cards end up moving around on their own, and they end up leading her to different places, and they end up it's just such a weird concept, but it was so well done and so mysterious and so magical in a certain circumstance, but they were also gruesome and uncomfortable. And you have these tales connected to the little tarot card she's drawing, and they end up actually leading you through the story. So you have this sister who draws these tarot cards, but she's also the one looking for the murderer. So we have, at the very beginning of the book, 2 women get murdered on the mountain. And you end up hearing about the murder through the mountain's perspective, which is really interesting and very different. The mountain actually has a couple different chapters to this story, and the mountain is telling the story of how these 2 women are murdered, which is very gruesome and brutal. So if you don't like gruesome and brutal, if you've read this, I'm sorry. So we end up hearing how these 2 women died through the mountain's perspective. And then the police start investigating. They have no leads. They don't know what's happening. They're questioning, but they're also like, it's not really important. Like, it feels like it's just a dead story, which is really unfortunate because these 2 women were just visiting this town. They had no connection, and they were just hiking through the mountains. And so our young character, our young sister, decides to investigate the murder. She's going to figure out who the murderer was, and she's going to catch him. And so we end up following her story of going through the mountain, trying to find clues, and she ends up finding clues, and she's not turning them into the police, which then makes me frustrated because I'm like, girl, go to the police. You're too young to be dealing with this. I think she's like 11 or 12 years old. She's really young, and she's just not meant to be doing this. But in her brain, she's like strong and powerful and fast, and she's like Rambo. But she's also still very young. However, my opinion does not matter to her because she is just her own character. She is her own strong lady. So she ends up doing this investigation to figure out who the murderer is. She tries to get her dogs involved. The dogs aren't involved. And she is determined to figure out who the murderer is. Let's go ahead and jump over to the other sister before I spoil you too much, unless you know what happened, because these are spoilers. So the other sister is described as hesitant and confused, and she feels judged by her peers, and she's just really in her head, which is fascinating because you end up learning about this rope that's tied around her neck, and it's like a noose, and she can see it, and she can feel it, and she can feel that the strings get thicker and thicker as the years go on, and she has this tail of the noose that ends up catching on things. Like, it literally pulls her back as she's walking through the forest, or if it catches on a bedpost, she gets pulled back. So it's actually physical to her, even though others can't see it. So she carries around this noose around her neck, and you're trying to figure out through the entire story what this noose is. And she's just trying to get by. She's just trying to help her mother feed the family. She just wants to go get a job so she can do more. She just wants to get through life. She doesn't want to stress about anything else. And so she has this sister who's obsessed with trying to figure out who the murderer is, and you have her who's just trying to get through life, just trying to make the next step the next day. And she feels weighed down, and she feels just burdened by society and by her life and by everything that's happening around her. So you have these 2 very, very contrasting characters. And then you have the mountain. And the mountain is actually portrayed as a young boy who meets our young girl, and there's this interesting connection between them. You question if it's a connection of romantic, even though we know our main girl is actually into girls. But there's this push that she's trying to be normal. She's trying to fit into society. She's trying to be what she's supposed to be. And it's really heavy, and it's really uncomfortable to see her kind of trudging through life with her sister just powering through life. And we end up coming to this end point where the youngest sister figures out who the murderer is. And she ends up finding out who the murderer is through the mountain's help. So she asks the Worm King, which is one of her tarot cards, show me the murderer. Take me to the murderer. You owe me this much. And so the mountain splits open and she ends up walking through this tunnel and finding where the murderer lives, where he's been staying. And she figures out who he is. And stuff happens. Bad stuff happens. She ends up getting found by him. It ends up being chaos. And her older sister, she's being led through this mysterious asylum that she's been working at by the mountain. So the mountain's also leading her through this mistake she made. She's walked into an area of the asylum that she's not supposed to be in, and she ends up being led out of the asylum by the mountain, by the young boy who's been being portrayed as the mountain. And they end up coming out into the forest, and she can hear her sister scream, and so she's running to her sister because even though her sister drives her absolutely crazy, she still loves her. So she's running to her sister and sees that her sister is fighting for her life against the murderer, and she realizes, I need to save her. So her and her sister end up working together. They end up catching the murderer, and they end up turning him in. A lot happens in that scene. I highly recommend reading this if you have not read this, but if you've read this, you know what I'm talking about. It's in a very intense scene of this battle of pain and struggle, and then you see these sisters realize their connection and their connection through the mountain, and this like moment of almost as if they're seeing everything above, and they end up getting safe, like I had mentioned. It was just a very interesting scene. It's one of those scenes where you're just like, whoa, what's happened? Me interrupting again. I completely forgot about this part, and that's how crazy this part of the book is. The guy doesn't just like go to jail. He ends up getting pretty much eaten by the mountain. It's pretty wild, and one of those moments where you just feel a bit confused. So I forgot about this, and I think it's funny that I forgot about it because it was just another step of that wildness from this book that I'm actually not surprised I forgot about it. But he does get pretty much eaten by the mountain, and that's how that part ended. This is where I get a little confused because I was like, oh, okay, that's the end of the story, but it's not the end of the story. We continue on because the sister with the noose around her neck is still struggling with that pain. The younger sister is realizing that she's not ready. She's not as strong as she thought she was. But that's not going to stop her. She's just going to keep powering forward. She's going to go join the army. She's going to join the military because she is strong. She knows who she is. And then you have her older sister who doesn't know who she is, who's confused, who's conflicted, until she tells her younger sister, I like girls. And her younger sister's like, okay, cool. And then we start seeing this transition of the noose lightening, the noose not being so heavy. And the more she comes into herself, she realizes the noose is always going to be there, but it's not always going to, but it doesn't always have to stop her from doing things. And so it's really interesting because you have this contrast in characters. If this was confusing, the book is confusing. I thought I was going crazy the entire time I read this because it's just like Bunny where you're like, wait, what happened? So I'm gonna put the book down because my hand's asleep. So you have like these two contrasting characters who feel pain and suffering, but they do it in different ways. So you have the younger sister who's going to power forward and be strong and keep doing it and keep being that strong character. And then you have the other character who's always worried about what society thinks of her. Until you have the end part where they end up joining a little bit more together, they end up understanding each other a little bit more, and they end up confiding in one another with the mountain. So the mountain is also part of their journey. It's almost like another mother to them. And it was really beautiful kind of seeing this transition because you're seeing a lot of like how the younger sister realizes she's not as strong as she thinks she is, but that's not going to stop her. And the older sister realizes society doesn't always have to push her down, and that doesn't have to stop her. So you just have this very strong movement forward. The noose ends up being, this is where I was confused. I had been trying to figure out what the noose was the entire story. The noose ends up being kind of society's noose around her, her boundaries she's created for herself, the feeling of worry and stress and everything being tied around her, tightening her and making her feel like she's being strangled by everything that's happening to her. And the more she relaxes, the more she realizes that she can be the person she wants to be, and she doesn't have to worry about what her sister thinks, because her sister loves her no matter what the other students in the school thinks, because they don't matter. She just has to realize that she should love herself and that she should accept herself, and the noose gets lighter. So it's a lot about this idea of identity and accepting yourself for who you are. And no matter what, we have burdens that push down on us, but we should continue to move forward and look for happiness and look for a good balance. So the book was really weird. I can't say that enough. It's one of those books where I read it and I was just confused at the end, and I had to process it for a couple days to figure out how I really felt about it. I still really enjoyed it. I would definitely have to reread it again. I think now that I have understanding of, one, what the noose is, and then also the magic of the mountain is actually like magic of the mountain and not an altered reality or fake or something else. It's actually like reality. I can actually approach this book in a different way, because that's one of the reasons why I had a really hard time with Bunny and Mona Awad, is because I was always trying to figure out what's reality and what's not reality. In this book, I was still struggling with that idea. And those are two books I have to reread. But Smothermoss by Alisa Alering, if you like weird, if you like confusing, like I said, you might actually like this, now that I've spoiled you if you've watched this far. But I think it's, even the things I've told you, you still probably don't know what happened in this book, because I was just confusing telling you. But I liked it, and I hope you liked it too. If you liked it, put a bunny in the bottom. That'd be cool. So if you've read this, put a bunny in the comments. The next one I'm going to be talking about is Diary of a Void by Emi Yagi. This one was also a bit odd, and like I said, a bit boring. But the boringness wasn't bad. That's the weird part about this. I have to drink something real quick, sorry. Because it's a slice of life book, you end up kind of following along as if you're following a diary entry. And the fact that in the middle, you get this really weird spot in the middle where you start to also question if she's pregnant. And that's the part where I wanted to talk about. That's the spoiler part that I'm going to talk about. Because the first half, you know she's faking it. She's told you directly, I'm faking being pregnant. And so you're like, okay, you're going to follow the awkward stories, the awkwardness when she's trying to figure out a baby's name, and she ends up just kind of like creating one because she doesn't want her coworker to come up with a name. But then you find out the coworker and his wife always wanted a baby. So then I was like, oh, maybe she can give her baby to them. But then I'm like, wait, she's not actually pregnant. So then I started like getting confused as if she was pregnant, because then she goes to the doctor's office. And then she also talks about how the baby's moving and kicking and people can feel the baby kicking. And the doctor says, oh, here's his feet. It's a little blurry, but there's the feet of the baby. And I'm thinking to myself, what? Is there really a baby in there? Has she just been like, well, what's the word? Hypochondriac? Yeah. But opposite. So instead of thinking that she has something, she's pretending that she doesn't have it, but she actually does. So maybe she's actually pregnant, but she's been trying to like convince herself that she's not pregnant. And so I got really confused in that part. I don't know if I was the only one, but I was like, wait, is she actually pregnant or is she not pregnant? There's a part of me that wonders if she was following all these steps and things to pretend she's pregnant, that she almost was convincing herself that. And then you get to the end and she has the baby, and then it's 12 months later and she's talking about how she's had the baby. We don't actually know if she's had the baby. She wakes up, she's bleeding, she's having abdominal pain, and that's the end of that part. That's the end of that chapter. And then we get to 12 months later, and she's talking about how she saved pictures from somebody else's Instagram so she can show that baby to people to pretend it's still her baby. So was she ever pregnant? I don't think so. Is she just so crazy that she's created this lie that's lasted over 2 years? Will she continue that lie? I have no idea what happened. And I hope I'm not alone. So I actually have not read too much about this online yet. I haven't had the time because I finished this while a friend was here and I just haven't jumped into the online world to figure out what other people thought about it, kind of what the author thought about it, what the author was getting to. But to be honest, this book was so weird. I felt bored, but also intrigued and confused. Intrigued is like one of my favorite words. Sorry, I say it all the time. But like I was fascinated by this lie and how it transformed to truth and back to lie, and it was just so awkward and fremdschämen. And so I don't have much to say about this one. I really don't. I think the food sounds absolutely delicious. The way she talks about food in this, I was just like, oh, I'm always hungry. And she talks about the weight gain because she's eating, but then you question if it's connected to pregnancy, but then you remind yourself, wait, she's not actually pregnant. And she's going to these pregnancy classes and watching people rub oil on their belly, and then she also rubs oil on her belly because it's expanding. But she's not actually pregnant. So is it just the food? But maybe she's actually pregnant. But maybe she's not. Maybe she gave the baby away. But she didn't give the baby away, because that's also what I was thinking about. I was like, well, if she's pregnant but not pregnant, so pretending she's not pregnant even though she is pregnant, but lying that she's pregnant so that people don't think she's pregnant, or people don't realize she's, I don't know how to say that. That was confusing. So maybe she is just pretending to be pregnant because she's really pregnant and doesn't want to admit it to herself. There we go. And then I thought, okay, well, why don't you give the baby, if you are pregnant, to your coworker who has been trying to have a baby for a while? But then I'm thinking to myself, but she's not pregnant. So, yeah, if you've read this one, put a little pregnant lady in the comments below. I would find it interesting what you guys also thought of this one. What you could do is if you thought she was pregnant, what you could do is you can put a pregnant lady and a thumbs up. And then if you didn't think she was pregnant, you can put a pregnant lady and a thumbs down. That will be our little trick to like talk about who thought what. But very weird and intriguing. And I don't have very much else to say about this one because there's not a lot that actually happened other than the question of was she or was she not? The last book I have to talk about is The Paris Bookseller by Kerri Maher. I kind of talked a little bit too much about this one in the first half of my video, but it's just because I just finished it and I have so many thoughts and so many feelings of this book. And it's not really a book I think I need to spoil or that would contain a lot of spoilers because we're just really following a young woman who is looking for a dream. She ends up finding a dream by walking into a bookshop and realizing that she can imagine herself doing the same thing. So she ends up opening her own bookshop. She ends up opening an English bookshop in Paris. It ends up being called Shakespeare and Company. She meets so many wonderful authors and writers who were not known back then. And she ends up befriending James Joyce. And if James Joyce was really, really like the character in this book, oh my goodness, what a I have a lot of thoughts about James Joyce, and I don't even know him. So if he's really like the character in here, I'm concerned and frustrated with him. And I'm surprised Sylvia could deal with so much of his crap sometimes, because that would be really hard. And I understand why Sylvia's partner, Adrina, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, didn't like James Joyce for most of the book, because I didn't like him for most of the book. I thought he was painful to read about because he was just so needy, and it was like, man, you're a grown man, stop it. Like, realize that you are being selfish sometimes. And when you're getting to the end where, so she's published Ulysses, even after all the pain and struggle and frustrations behind it, she's finally accomplished this wonderful goal. And in the end, he's pretty much saying, you're destroying my career or destroying my life and destroying my book's possibility of success by not letting go of the copyright rights. And I thought that was so frustrating to read about because Sylvia put her life into this book. Sylvia did everything she could to make sure Ulysses would get the recognition and be seen by so many authors and readers and writers, and also be taken to the US when it was banned there. She was sneaking books across the border. Like, that's really cool. Like the idea of sneaking books across the border because they're not allowed is pretty cool. But it's also, what a painstaking activity, and she did so much for him. She paid his bills. She helped him figure out like what he was just doing, and the thing she gets is him being like, you're taking my, you're ruining my possibilities of moving forward. And it was just such a frustrating part of the book. So other than that, well, not even that. That didn't even ruin the book because you're still so connected with Sylvia Beach. She's such a sweetheart. She's a powerful woman trying to give everything to everybody, but then you're also thinking to her, you're thinking, Sylvia, take Adrina's advice and give yourself a little bit more love and care and focus on yourself a little bit more, because you're giving too much out. And if you give too much out, there's nothing left to give, one, to the person you love, but also to yourself. And this book is full of pain and wonder and also joy. And the fact I went to where the original shop is. So Shakespeare and Company exists today, but it's not the original shop. It was reopened. I actually don't know when it was reopened. It doesn't talk about it in the story. But the original shop was opened in 1919, and there's 2 locations it was at. I went and visited the second location it opened at, which was across the street from Adriana's. Oh man, I'm gonna say like 6 different names. From her French girlfriend's bookstore. So we went to that location, and I stood across the street as if I was Sylvia's girlfriend and looked at the building that this shop used to be in, and it was so magical. It was weird. It's really hard to explain this, but it's no longer there. It's a clothing shop. It's a small little clothing shop. But imagining that this little tiny shop used to sit there, and all these amazing artists used to walk through the door and just converse about some of the most beautiful things. And they questioned if they were going to be great, and they questioned if they were going to become something. And it was just really magnificent. It was one of those moments where I was just like, wow, I was standing where these amazing authors once stood. And it was just really magical. And I thought to myself, like, how do you become something like this? How do you know if you're going to become something? And you never do. Like, Hemingway feared that he would never be known as well as Fitzgerald, who wrote The Great Gatsby. He stressed that he would never become more. And now he's so well known. You learn about him in school. That he's known for so many books. I mean, I even have a book right here, The Old Man and the Sea, because I'm planning to read this. And it's because they were so influential, and they changed what writing was. The fact that Ulysses was even published changed what writing could be and what writing turned out to be. This book was previously considered lustful and disturbing and erotic, and I haven't read Ulysses, so I don't actually know like how erotic it went. But when we compare it to some of the other books that we've read, some of the other books that are popular on TikTok, I mean, it can't be that lustful. And I mean, even in this book, we had lustful scenes, and it can't be that lustful, but maybe I have to read it. I don't know. That's a really big book, and I've heard it's really complicated too. And based on what everybody talked about in this novel, it's a very complicated novel. It's not something that you just read in one day or a week or a month. It's a book that you sit down and you read for a while. So I really loved this book. I thought it was fascinating and lovely, and Sylvia Beach is somebody to inspire to. This book made me question on if I should open an English bookshop here in Germany and just have a place where people can come and have a conversation about the writing and the future of writing. And I think about it a lot now. I've thought about it every single day. Do I need to open a bookshop where all of the great writers will be available to read in this bookshop? But, you know, dreams. Maybe it'll happen. And then a little cafe. And some other things. But There's not much to spoil this book, because the thing about historical fictions is that the story already exists, and people already know about the story, and people already know what's happened. And if you know the story of Ulysses and how it came to be, you already know what's happened in this novel. But what was wonderful about this book was that you're seeing it through Sylvia Beach's perspective, and you're seeing her struggle and her pain and her work and her love all through the lines in this story. And it was just truly beautiful. And there was one line that I really enjoyed, and it's Sylvia having a conversation with her partner Adrina, and Adrina says, "Sylvia, you must stop worrying like this," Adrina said one morning as they lay in bed listening to the birds greet the sun. "But I've put everything into Joyce's book. What if it fails? What if it does? You'll still have Shakespeare and company, and Odinia is much more than Ulysses. I just don't want to fail. I know you don't, and it won't, but if it does, the failure will be his, not yours." She wasn't sure about that. And the idea of failure, I think, is the fear of failure, not the idea. The fear of failure is something that I think a lot of us struggle with. And it's the idea, for example, I just mentioned opening a bookshop here in Germany. It's a possibility. It's something I could do. But there's also a part of me that fears, what if I can't? What if I make that plan and it fails? What if I put all of my effort and energy and money into this plan and it doesn't come to fruition? But there's also this question of, if we never try, then what's the point? Like, our lives are full of adventure and possibilities. And just like Sylvia Beach, she went to Paris and opened a small bookshop on a whim. And she had help from her family, of course. Like, she had tons of help also from the writers. Like, think about, could you imagine having like Hemingway or James Joyce or Fitzgerald just walk into a bookshop right now? That'd be absolutely crazy. But then also remember, back then, these authors weren't known. They weren't special. They weren't anything more than you or me. So we have dreams and we have motivations and we have wants, and we should pursue them, even if they're scary, even if there's a possibility of failure. And this was a lovely book because it reminded me that things are hard and doing anything is hard. But without doing them, life is a little boring. Like Diary of a Void, it gets a little boring. So you have to lie about being pregnant. Please do not do that. So this was truly a lovely book. If you are passionate about reading or books or new things, then I highly recommend reading this because it was just truly lovely. And if you've been to Paris, I highly recommend reading it too. So my camera's about to die. I'm gonna leave it there. I super appreciate you guys being here. I super love the fact that you've joined me on this first episode of what I've read so far in my Fall TBR. And I'm so excited to continue reading parts of my Fall TBR and having you guys join me. Oh, and if you've read this, put little books down below, or like the Eiffel Tower. Books and an Eiffel Tower, do both. So we can see who's read what. And I hope you guys have a fantastic day, a lovely rest of your week and weekend. And I can't wait to see you guys next week where we'll be doing a fun activity. I don't know what yet. Maybe we're going to maybe we'll actually put together a fall bucket list, because last week's video was just kind of like an idea. Maybe next week will be the full fall bucket list of all of the fun things we'll be doing over the next couple months. So until next time, you guys, have a fantastic day, and I'll see you guys soon. Ciao!